Classical Chinese was not just an old version of modern Chinese. It was the written language of an entire intellectual world. Beginning around the 5th century BCE, the great classics of Chinese literature, philosophy, history, and political thought were written in a compact style that later generations treated as the model of serious writing. For centuries, scholars did not simply read these texts as historical artifacts. They imitated their grammar, their phrasing, and their dense way of expressing ideas. Over time, this created a long-lasting literary tradition now usually called literary Chinese. It became the language of official documents, scholarship, poetry, moral philosophy, and elite education. To understand classical Chinese is to understand how a written style could become a cultural institution, shaping how people governed, studied, argued, and remembered the past across much of East Asia. One of the most striking features of classical Chinese is its terseness. In modern vernacular Chinese, many words are made of 2 or more characters, and grammar often depends on particles, word order, and contexts that feel relatively familiar to modern readers. Classical Chinese works differently. A single written character often corresponds to one independent word, and sentences can be extremely compressed. A line that looks short on the page may contain a full argument, a subtle contrast, or an entire moral lesson. This made the language elegant and efficient, but also difficult. Readers had to supply missing relationships from context, who is acting, what is being compared, whether a word is a noun or a verb, and how one phrase connects to the next. The result is a language that can appear simple in form while demanding deep training to interpret accurately. The word classical matters because the style was tied to revered texts. Works associated with Confucian thought, early histories, ritual traditions, and philosophical debate became models for education and governance. Later writers learned to write by studying them, memorizing them, quoting them, and adapting their patterns. This created a conservative force in written culture. Spoken Chinese changed over time, as all languages do. Regional varieties developed, pronunciations shifted, vocabulary evolved, and everyday speech moved farther away from the ancient texts. But formal writing remained anchored to older models. A scholar centuries later might live in a world where spoken language had changed dramatically, yet still write in a style designed to echo pre-imperial or early imperial classics. Classical Chinese therefore became less a natural spoken language and more a disciplined written code. This separation between written form and spoken language is essential. Literary Chinese was not static, and it did change over time, but its changes were restrained. It absorbed some later habits, and different periods had recognizable styles, yet the prestige of the classics limited how far formal writing could drift. Many developments in spoken Chinese varieties never fully entered the literary standard. That meant a person who spoke a later form of Chinese could not simply read literary Chinese as if it were ordinary speech written down. Even reading it aloud did not solve the problem. The written text carried meanings from older vocabulary and older syntax. Someone familiar only with modern vernacular Chinese might recognize many characters, but still miss the structure, the allusions, and the compact logic that make the text work. For most of Chinese history, literary Chinese was the language of authority. It was used for official memorials, administrative records, legal documents, historical writing, essays, and serious scholarship. In an empire that contained many regions and many speech varieties, a shared written standard had obvious advantages. It allowed officials trained in the same textual tradition to communicate across distance and dialect. It also reinforced the power of education. Mastery of literary Chinese was not just a technical skill. It was a mark of status, discipline, and access to the governing class. The civil service tradition depended heavily on the ability to read, interpret, and compose in this elevated style. In that sense, literary Chinese functioned as both a language and a gatekeeping system. The influence of literary Chinese did not stop at China's borders. Beginning around the 2nd century CE, it spread into neighboring societies deeply shaped by Chinese cultural and political models, including Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands. In many of these places, it represented the main shared written medium for long periods. This did not mean people in those societies spoke Chinese in everyday life. Rather, literary Chinese became a written language of learning, administration, diplomacy, and elite communication. It allowed scholars and officials from different linguistic backgrounds to participate in a shared textual civilization. This wider cultural zone is often called the Sinosphere, a world connected not by identical speech, but by common models of writing, education, bureaucracy, and classical reference. The spread of literary Chinese created a fascinating situation. A Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, or Ryukyuan scholar could read and write texts in a language that was not their native spoken language, while interpreting it through local systems. Each society developed methods for making sense of the Chinese text in terms of its own grammar and pronunciation. These included reading traditions, annotation marks, glosses, and ordering systems that helped readers convert the compact written form into something intelligible through the local vernacular. In Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, this produced complex relationships between Chinese characters and local languages. Literary Chinese was therefore not simply imported and copied. It was actively adapted. People built intellectual tools around it so that a foreign written code could serve local political, religious, and scholarly needs. This is why literary Chinese can be compared to Latin in medieval and early modern Europe, though the comparison is not perfect. Like Latin, it served as a prestigious language of scholarship, administration, and trans-regional communication long after it ceased to match ordinary speech. It allowed educated people across different regions to access a common archive of texts and ideas. But literary Chinese was deeply tied to a logographic writing system, where characters carried meaning across different pronunciations. A reader in Japan and a reader in Korea might pronounce the same written passage differently, yet still engage with the same text. That gave literary Chinese a unique kind of portability. Its written form could cross spoken language boundaries in a way that alphabetic systems often could not. The difficulty of classical Chinese comes not only from age, but from density. Words can shift function depending on position. A character may behave like a noun in one line, a verb in another, and an abstract concept in a third. Pronouns, tense markers, and connectives may be absent or implied. Meaning often depends on parallelism, contrast, rhythm, and cultural allusion. A short passage might assume that the reader knows earlier classics, historical examples, moral categories, or ritual vocabulary. This is why literary training mattered so much. Reading classical Chinese was not just decoding characters. It was entering a tradition of commentary. Generations of scholars wrote notes explaining grammar, resolving ambiguities, identifying quotations, and debating interpretations. The language invited interpretation because it often left room for it. Over time, however, the gap between literary Chinese and everyday language became harder to defend. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, reformers increasingly argued that formal writing should become more accessible and closer to spoken language. In China, this helped drive the rise of written vernacular Chinese, often associated with educational reform, modernization, and new forms of journalism and literature. The change was not merely linguistic. It was political and social. If the old written standard required years of elite training, a vernacular standard promised broader literacy and wider public participation. Similar shifts occurred in neighboring societies, where local vernaculars replaced literary Chinese in formal roles. The old classical medium did not vanish overnight, but its practical dominance declined rapidly. Even after being replaced in daily formal writing, classical Chinese remains culturally powerful. It survives in idioms, quotations, poetry, historical documents, religious texts, philosophical traditions, calligraphy, and legal or ceremonial phrases. Modern Chinese languages still contain many cognates connected to older words in the classical lexicon, even though pronunciation and usage have changed. In Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, the legacy is also visible through borrowed vocabulary, character traditions, historical records, and educational memory. Many modern terms in government, philosophy, science, and culture were shaped through Chinese character vocabulary. So the story of classical Chinese is not simply the story of a dead language. It is the story of a written infrastructure whose traces remain embedded in modern East Asian languages and identities. Classical Chinese shows how writing can outlive speech, empire, and even the everyday needs that first supported it. It began as the language of ancient texts, became the foundation of an elite literary tradition, spread across borders, and helped define a shared East Asian scholarly world. Its compact style made it powerful, memorable, and elegant, but also difficult and exclusive. Its conservatism preserved ancient forms while spoken languages moved on. Its prestige connected cultures, but also created barriers between educated elites and ordinary readers. Today, studying classical Chinese means more than learning old grammar. It means seeing how a civilization organized knowledge, authority, memory, and cultural prestige through writing. Few languages have shaped so much history while being so little tied to one single way of speaking. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.